Good evening and welcome to another study in the book of Acts. We are in Acts chapter 21, if you want to have your Bibles turned there. And we had just concluded the point where Paul had told that he's going to Jerusalem. Agabus had prophesied that he's going to be arrested while he was there. And the brethren were fearful for his life, although they could not persuade him not to go. Paul was determined in his spirit to go to Jerusalem and then also to Rome, as we're going to see a little later on. Maybe not in this lesson, possibly the next, but what we're going to talk about primarily in this lesson is what happens in Jerusalem when Paul goes there, and then his subsequent arrest while he's in Jerusalem, and hopefully we'll get to Paul's speech to the rioting crowd in Jerusalem, and we'll go through some illustrations, I hope, at the end of this lesson. But I appreciate you watching this evening, and Lord willing, we'll have another good lesson to look forward to. We're in Acts chapter 21, and where we left off was right around verse 15, and that's where we're going to begin reading this evening if you want to join along. So let's read together. Acts 21, verse 15. And after those days we packed and went up to Jerusalem, and also some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, and brought with them one Mason of Cyprus, an early disciple, with whom we were to lodge. And when we had come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. When he had greeted them, he told them in detail those things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said to him, "You see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law." That's where we're going to stop right now. Before we go any further, let's look at this map I have up here on the screen to remind us of where we are in Paul's journey. This is where his third journey is going to end officially, here in Jerusalem. And we had started in Caesarea, where Paul had stayed with Philip. Remember Philip? One of the seven. And he had lodged in Caesarea since his time in witnessing to the Samaritans and the Ethiopian eunuch. And he stayed in Caesarea. And Caesarea is about 64 miles north of Jerusalem, although when we go down to Jerusalem, you're actually going up in elevation. So often in the scriptures, it will be described as going up to Jerusalem. And when it says that, it means up in elevation specifically. So it says, after those days, we packed up, as my translations say. Your translation might say we took up our baggage. The English word used that is used here is not a very common word, and translators think that from this language it means that he literally saddled or packed up their horses, and that's how they journeyed to the south and to Jerusalem. It will be a rocky terrain, and so it would be a lot easier to have a pack mule or a horse of some sort and be able to ride on those instead of having to walk on foot, which would have been a whole lot harder, especially as the elevation started changing. And depending on how fast you wanted to get there, it's a lot faster if you went on an animal instead of walking on foot. It says also in verse 16 that some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us and brought with them one Nason of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we were to lodge. And so there was an early disciple, Mason, mentioned here. After the brethren could not persuade Paul to stay away from Jerusalem, it seems that some there in Caesarea, some of the brethren were prepared themselves to actually go with Paul on the journey as he travels. This is, as it says, this is going to be during the time of a feast, and this feast day or Pentecost feast is whenever Paul said earlier that he wanted to make it by to Jerusalem. And so during this Pentecost, multitudes of Jewish brethren would be there, and Jews would be there, and Jewish Christians would be there who still observed the ceremonial rites of the law in some way. and some who were persuaded by the Judaizing teachers obviously would be there. All these would be there to constitute a lot of people, somewhere in the realm of 500,000 plus, possibly up to 1 million people would have been in the city during Pentecost to celebrate this feast. And so these brethren who came with Paul would likely be there with him to assist in his greetings to the church at Jerusalem and to be a witness to what Paul did among the Gentiles. They were Gentiles and they were witness. They were in the company of Paul, and so there's going to be some Gentiles with Paul as he goes into the city, and this by itself is going to be part of the reason why Paul is arrested later while he's in the temple. But we'll get there. And one person, Mason of Cyprus, is going to be with him, which is very interesting. An early disciple. Some scholars think that he was as early as the Pentecost that was mentioned in Acts chapter 2, maybe one of the very first converts that was there, represented as one of the nations in Acts chapter 2. He could be a witness to all of the things, not only that Paul did, but from the very beginning, whenever the Holy Spirit was poured out on the apostles, and how the church grew and spread. And so he could be a pretty stand-up witness to what God had accomplished through Paul. But we don't know that for sure. All the text says is that he is an early disciple. And anything outside of that is really just speculation. But it's very interesting to think about the company that Paul brings into a city, Jerusalem, full of Jews during a Jewish festival. And of course, we know the reasoning that he is doing this. It's to bring the contribution that the Gentile churches were to bring and lay at the feet of the disciples, the apostles in the Jerusalem church for their aid. And this was going to be an expressive act of love and unity towards the brethren there. And these Gentile assistants that Paul had would likely be as representatives. And so it was a diverse mix of people that were with Paul for sure. This man Mason was originally from Cyprus. And so some think that since the city was going to be so full of people, it would have been hard to find lodging during this festival, but as Mason would have been known to them, maybe that he could have found a lodging place for them, and that was his purpose. But we don't know. This is the point where we end his third missionary journey officially. His journeys have come to an end now, and so as we look through here on this third missionary journey route, we start in Antioch as we always do, and it ends in Jerusalem, and that's where it stops. And the next map that we'll have up after this lesson is going to be Paul's journey to Rome, and we'll talk about his voyage there, because there's quite a few places to talk about on that journey as well, with some good illustrations that we'll associate with that lesson. But here I just wanted you to see that at the very end of his journey, where we left off last time in Caesarea, and you can see these cities that are along the way that possibly they could have stayed at, but they ended up going to Jerusalem, is where Paul was arrested there in this chapter. Or actually, in the end of this chapter and also in chapter 22 is where he actually starts making his way toward Rome. So we've come through a lot of places here, and it says in verse 17, when we had come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. So his entrance was good. His entrance and reception of the brethren there, the church there, was a happy reception. On the following day, in verse 18, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. When we had greeted them and told in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry, everybody praised God and was happy. And they knew that God had done many things through Paul with the Gentiles. But then there was a charge, a worry that the church of Jerusalem brings to Paul's attention. And this has to do with the Jews, as we're going to learn later, that were from Asia. These Jewish teachers that were following Paul and causing trouble wherever he goes. They resented Paul. They hated his preaching. He was making many disciples, and he was turning many Jews to Christ. And this angered the Jews, and they followed him everywhere, disputing what he said and causing trouble for him, causing harm to him, trying to kill him, but most importantly, contradicting Jesus and the gospel. And so we're going to find them causing issues among the brethren here also. So let's read from verse 20. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord, and they said to him, "You see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. But they have been informed about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to their customs. So what then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear that you have come. Therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. But concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing, except they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality." Then Paul took them in, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each of them. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was disturbed. And the people ran together, seized Paul, and dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. And so now we have some things to discuss before we go on any further. But let's go to the questions now as we move forward in our lesson. This is the more of a Roman roadmap of how Paul would have traveled from Caesarea to Jerusalem. As you can see, Jerusalem is there on an elevated mount. This is in a hilly region, and higher in elevation. And so from the coast where Caesarea is, you can see that the journey as they entered into this rocky terrain would be a little more difficult. But there were roads, and they weren't perfect roads, but it would have been a lot easier to travel on the back of an animal than to walk, and I think that's what they did. But in any case, this is one of the routes they could have taken up to Jerusalem. So, who accompanied Paul to Jerusalem? Do you remember from Caesarea? Some disciples decided to travel with him, and also Mason of Cyprus. And what did Paul tell James and the elders whenever he was received and greeted by the brethren there? The things that God had done through him, through his ministry. And how did they react? They glorified the Lord. So you can see, just by going over these questions, that the initial reaction of the church there was to be receptive of Paul. I don't think they were suspect of what he taught, but there were some people, some Jews, who had believed, that is, they had obeyed the gospel, and they believed, although they were still mixed up in the law in some way. And they were under the impression, probably because of these Jews that had come in following Paul and rebuking and refuting what he had been teaching, had told the brethren that Paul had taught the people against the law, against the temple, and against the customs of the law, like circumcision, and had taught people not to follow the law and not to circumcise their children. This is a completely different set of people, and we'll talk about this group of people in a little bit. But this is what the Jewish believers had been told about Paul, that he had taught them not to walk according to the customs, that is the customs of the law. Now, Paul had always taught that the law wasn't binding for salvation, that salvation was by faith in Jesus Christ, and so there was no salvation in the law. But as far as the customs of the law in themselves, they weren't harmful in any way. With the knowledge that the law isn't what brought salvation anymore, there were a lot of, even Paul himself, who still kept the Jewish customs, because the Jewish way of life was very deeply ingrained in the way that they did things, and Paul did things in some ways going along with that line also, as we'll talk about in a little bit. What was the plan suggested to Paul? Take 4 men who had taken a vow, be purified with them, and pay their expenses. And this was for the purpose of accomplishing the idea that Paul, what these things had been brought against Paul were amounted to nothing, and that they were false. So the people had a visible sign in what Paul was doing, showing that he supported these, he still followed these customs, and so these accusations amounted to nothing. And so let's talk about these charges again for a second. Now, the charge is kind of a half-truth if we think about it. Paul had preached Christ, and it was more than advising the Jews than becoming a Gentile, basically, is what they were accusing him of teaching. Paul never taught the Jews that when they became Christians, they had to stop circumcising their children. He never taught that. As a matter of fact, when we look back at Acts 16, whenever he picked up Timothy, he had him circumcised because his father was Greek. Although his mother was a Jew, his father was Greek. And in order, as Paul did, to present his case or the gospel to the Jews, as he did, as he went into a city and entered into the synagogue, and had to have Timothy as his assistant, he needed to be able to have this a way in to their hearts, or into their respect. And the only way to do that was to circumcise him, because there were Jews that Paul was dealing with. If Timothy was with him and he wasn't circumcised, then they wouldn't even allow him entry. So Paul had Timothy circumcised for the purpose of a way into their hearts, because circumcision isn't anything and uncircumcision isn't anything, as Paul often taught. But what he did was he used it as a tool in order to gain entrance into the assembly, and also to be able to preach Christ to them. And so this he did. And Paul was a true follower of Christ in every way. And he had taught that circumcision the seal of the covenant that God had made with Abraham. This seal of the covenant, which came before Jesus Christ, it became, now that Christ had died and had risen and has all authority, this circumcision, this seal of the covenant, had no effect on the relationship that man had with God anymore. And so it preceded Christ, and it was still something that they could do or not do, but it had no effect on their salvation, on their relationship with God. The Judaizing teachers saw what the end of these teachings was going to become. Now, as it says, one of the accusations was he taught against the customs, and to walk in the customs, to walk after the customs, amounted to following the ceremonial law, the rites and the rituals that came along with all the things that they did, especially in these holy days, in the Holy Week that they were in, this Pentecostal celebration here. This was the same charge. If we remember Stephen back in Acts chapter 6, this was the same charge that he changed the customs that Moses delivered. The charge that was against Paul with respect to this, to the ritual that Moses gave, was only true in the sense that he denied their necessity to the salvation of souls. And everything underneath that was just custom and ceremonial. But it had no effect on their salvation. In verse 22, again, it says, "What then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear what that you have come." And so the question here simply means, so what's to become of this? What do we do about this? James and the elders at Jerusalem didn't believe these misrepresentations that were brought against Paul. However, many of the Jewish brethren that were there did believe them. They hadn't come to a full understanding of this. They were still very deeply entrenched and intertwined in these ceremonial things that had concerned the law. And so this wasn't a way to conceal what Paul was doing. They were ready to meet the issue face on, but they were ready to meet it tactfully. It was a symbolic way that they came up with to show the people that Paul still followed these ceremonial rites. And to Paul that didn't really mean much, because salvation wasn't in the law, it's in Christ. And so the Jewish Christians would be anxious to see Paul and hear the reports he had to make. And so this was more of a cooperative way to bring the two groups together. And Paul was willing to do that, as he was willing to circumcise Timothy. And I imagine originally, as he's going to have the ability to preach to that crowd in a little while in the chapter anyway, probably not in the way that he wanted to, but that was his intention, is to bring together the people and then be able to preach Christ to them. And that's what Paul did. And so verse 23, these recommendations that they gave, therefore do this. It seems that Paul couldn't meet with every individual Jewish Christian that was there. That would have been impossible, but he could have made a symbolic gesture that would have met all of their expectations. And so they advised him about these four men who had taken a vow, similar to the vow that Paul had taken previously. This was a temporary Nazirite vow. They shaved their heads, but part of the Nazirite, the law concerning the Nazirite vow, there was a part in there that allowed for their expenses to be paid for. And so as a representative of these men, Paul would pay for their expenses, and he would see to their purification and see them through this vow, which was seven days. And this would have been done as a visible way that the people could see him in the temple and see him through this ceremonial process, and then know that he wasn't speaking against these rituals or these ceremonies in doing this. This wasn't Paul denying Christ, and this wasn't Paul lying. And a lot of commentators have gone back and forth about why Paul did this. This was Paul being a Jew himself and going through these ceremonial rites, and very similar to how we celebrate our holidays today. And we don't think of it as a religious requirement to celebrate any of the holidays that we celebrate. And so it's no big deal for us to celebrate some of these holidays. But as a Christian, I don't celebrate Christmas as a religious holiday, because it hasn't been given to us in the scriptures in that way. Although some in the world do, I can do that without affecting my conscience. And in a similar way, Paul is going through these ceremonial rites as a Jew himself, without considering it a religious requirement or considering it a requirement for salvation to God. So it was a good thing for Paul to do this, to bring the two groups together. You might disagree with that. That's just my opinion. We can talk more about that in another lesson, but in any case, it did not happen in the way that was planned because of what's going to happen next in the temple. The Jews had seen Paul in the temple. Previously, they had seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city. They had not seen him in the temple, but they supposed that Paul had brought Gentiles into the temple because they had seen the company that had been with Paul in the city in his initial entry to the brethren there. And plus the Jews that were after him were looking for reasons to accuse him for everything. So it happened in the way that we didn't want it to happen. They took Paul, as it said, as these men cried out, they took Paul. The whole city was brought into a riot, which is very common during these religious feasts, even today. And they drug him out of the temple, and they immediately shut the temple doors. The temple guardians or the priests shut the doors. They didn't want any more disturbance of what was going on. And so there was, to me, that just solidifies the doors to the temple, physical temple, are shut. And they're no longer accessible because God is not in the physical temple in Jerusalem anymore. Between the two cherubim of the Ark of the Covenant, that's not where God is anymore. So this symbolic, I think, as Luke puts it here, that the doors were shut, but God is still open to us through faith in Jesus Christ. And we can boldly go before his throne of grace because we have Christ as his mediator. And so these temple doors being shut in the physical temple, it really amounts to nothing. But I think it's very symbolic. And plus, it would have prevented any more disturbance for whatever was going on in the temple at the time. And on the outside of this temple, which is ironic, the Jews were preaching peace with God, but then at the same time they were literally killing Paul. They were beating him to death. And this is where we left off at verse 31. Now, as they were seeking to kill him by beating him, as it said a little later on, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, and he immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came near and took him, commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and asked him who he was and what he had done. Some of the multitude cried one thing and some another, and when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. And so no one could agree with that. Some of them didn't even know who Paul was, and so nobody's statements had made any sense to the commander, and they weren't agreeing with each other. And so he commanded him to be taken into the barracks so he could question him. Verse 35, when he had reached the stairs, he had to be carried to by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. I take this as because of what condition he was in, because the mob had been beating him, and because he was very weak probably and having trouble getting up the stairs, and the mob was still grabbing after him and trying to pull him down and kill him. The soldiers lifted him up and carried him the rest of the way up the stairs to prevent death, because he was going to be questioned by the commander of the garrison. In verse 37, Paul was about, verse 36, for the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, away with him. That is the same thing that they screamed at Jesus whenever he was going to be crucified, and Pilate was asking about Barabbas. They said, "Away with Jesus," and they brought him out to crucify him. Same attitude. They wanted to kill Paul for sure. And as Paul was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" He replied, "Can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago raised an insurrection and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" But Paul said, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people." So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language. And that's where we're going to stop reading. But we're going to continue with our questions and talk about these things. James and the elders by their questioning, do you think they had changed their position concerning what was decided in Acts 15? Remember this council that had met together in Acts 15, the Council of Jerusalem, where Paul and Barnabas spoke, and then Peter spoke and James spoke. And they decided at this time not to disturb the Gentiles with this Judaizing teaching about keeping the law or circumcision, to refrain from idols, sexual immorality, things strangled, and blood. That was their decision to the Gentiles. And they did not change their position. They actually reiterated the points of the letter whenever they were talking to Paul. The Gentiles were acceptable by God. They had decided that. But as far as the Jews, that was another question to them. And there was a lot of confusion about the Jews and whether or not the law was still binding on them. Although they had not been binding the law on the Gentiles, there were still some Jewish brethren who taught that you had to keep the law to be saved, which was absolutely false, but that doesn't help Paul's situation any while he's in Jerusalem. So, where did the Jews come from? The ones that saw Paul in the temple. These were the same ones that disturbed him throughout Asia and followed him. Most likely they were there for Pentecost. But I imagine that there were some who were still looking to find a way to accuse Paul, and probably were looking for him. How did they stir up the people? They cried out that Paul taught all men everywhere against the people, the law, and the temple. These accusations are very similar to the ones made to Stephen, and very similar to the ones that were brought against Jesus also. And so these Jews from Asia, they claimed that Paul brought Greeks into the temple and defiled it because they saw Trophimus, a Gentile Ephesian, with Paul in the city. And they saw some strange Jews now with Paul in the court of the temple. These 4 men who had shaved their heads, and they were going through this vow, and they assumed that Paul had taken Trophimus into the temple with him, and they were wrong. They didn't take the time to see if that was correct, to investigate or anything like that. They were so eager to bring charges against Paul and were very anxious in finding a way to accuse him that they didn't hesitate. They didn't hesitate to bring charges against him. And maybe they were honest about their accusations, but maybe mistaken. But I think that they were just looking for a way to accuse Paul. They based their charges against Paul on supposition, as the scriptures say. They supposed that he had brought Trophimus into the temple. They were wrong. Their supposition was false. But they didn't care whether it was true or false. It was a convenient time to bring charges against Paul, and that's what they did. They stirred up the entire city. In verse 30, all the city was moved. Jews from Asia were successful in causing a riot against Paul. And so this moving of the city was stirring. There was a violence is what it was. Emotional reaction and violence against Paul. And this same word is going to be used in stirring up a riot against Paul later in Acts 24. The people ran together. They came from all quarters of the city, and this riot spread, and it pushed into part of the temple. And so they drug Paul out, I guess, to save the temple from violation, from impurities. So they drug Paul out of the temple and shut the doors. They didn't want to have anything to do with that inside the temple because of the uncleanness that it was attached in their minds, that was attached to it. And so they brought him out, and they began trying to kill him. They began beating him, as the scripture said, as they were seeking to kill him in verse 31. That was their intention. And whenever news of this reached the Roman garrison, they brought a lot of Romans, as we're going to look at, and saved him, basically. This wasn't for the purpose of saving his life, more for the purpose of assuming that there was something that he did wrong, that is Paul, and then the commander of the garrison wanted to question him himself. This was all in order to keep the peace. Jerusalem was still under Roman jurisdiction, even though they were allowed to have this holy holiday. It was still under supervision of the Romans. And so whenever there were riots that often happened in these holy festivals inside the walls of Jerusalem, the Roman garrisons were responsible for keeping the peace. And they resorted to violence to keep the peace, as we're going to see later on in the book of Acts. And so this is what happened here. The chief captain, as he's called in some translations, the garrison consisted, some say, of about 1,000 soldiers. So he took soldiers and centurions. Now we know what a centurion, soldiers and leaders of hundreds. So there's going to be bands of hundreds of soldiers and groups that were coming in, trying to move away the crowds and calm down the crowds, and in whatever ways that the Romans thought fit, and then take Paul away from their hands to bring him in for investigation. They arrested Paul, as the scriptures said. They seized him, and so they brought him in for questioning, and the chief captain, or the commander, as he's called in my translation, arrested him, laid hold of him, bound him in chains, as it said, 2 chains. And they bound him on suspicion that he was a violent person, that he is the one who caused the riot, that he was a criminal of some kind. As we're going to learn later, they thought he was the leader of a band of assassins, the Egyptian who led a band of assassins out in the wilderness. Assassin, it literally means man of the dagger, and that's where the word assassin comes from. They had these short daggers that they carried in order to kill, and so they thought Paul was their leader and somehow. And so what did the Jews suppose was in the temple, because they saw him previously? Trophimus the Ephesian. And what did all the city do after the accusation? They seized him and dragged him out of the temple, and the commander of the garrison took soldiers and centurions and arrested him and questioned him. They had to carry him out because of the violence of the mob. Who did the commander think that Paul was when Paul asked to speak to him? An Egyptian insurrectionist, an assassin, who led a band of 4,000 men out in the wilderness. A Roman criminal, essentially, is what that amounts to. An anarchist, somebody who was a violent and seditious person. And so that's what he asked. Are you not the Egyptian? And then Paul spoke to him in Greek. And this is not something that an uneducated assassin would do. He was obviously surprised to hear Paul speak in Greek. Can you speak Greek? And Paul did. And this was the language of the cultured, refined person, the Greek language. He inquired further whether he was the leader. And Paul says that he was a citizen of Cilicia, a citizen of Tarsus of Cilicia, a free city, of no mean city. It was a grand city. And he was a Jew, but he was a citizen. And that was the key point. He was not the man who the commander supposed that that thought maybe he was, I guess. And he was a more refined and cultured person, and obviously a very educated person. And so he was allowed to speak. And I am a Jew of Tarsus, of Cilicia. It was a metropolis. It was a grand city. It was known for its culture and its philosophic studies. It had great schools there. It was a city of prominence, and it was one of the great cities of the empire. It had universities there. And Paul was a citizen of that city. It was an honorable distinction that Paul was making for himself. And so he, after briefly telling him who he was, he asked to speak to the people and was granted permission. And after receiving permission, what did Paul do? He stood on the stairs above where the riot was, outside of the reach of the people, and he began to speak to them in the Hebrew language. Paul was an educated person, and speaking to them in the Hebrew language after motioning his hand to the same people who were trying to kill him would have brought attention. And so it quieted down everybody, and he began speaking to them in the Hebrew language, the language of their fathers, the language of the city, the language of the Hebrew people. And so they took him seriously whenever he began to speak. But that's where we end. That's where we leave our lesson today. And we're going to talk about what Paul said to them and the results of that in our next lesson as we go into chapter 22. But first I want to go in through and talk and look at just a few illustrations before we end the lesson. This is a Roman mile marker. It would have been the 4th mile outside of Antipas and Lod, 2 cities that were between Caesarea and Jerusalem, possibly where Paul would have traveled through. This is, if you look at an aerial view of the terrain, you can see just how difficult it might have been to travel on foot through these regions. And so they packed up, literally, some people mean that literally means they packed up their animals and they traveled that way. This is the route to Jerusalem on the Beth Horon Ridge as you're looking from the west. So you have here toward Antipas in the north, toward Jerusalem in the south, but you can see as you go toward Jerusalem that it kind of starts raising up in elevation. Pretty difficult to get there. This is a road leading into Jerusalem more recently in the last 100 years or so. You can see all the rocks. Somebody once said that when God made the earth, he put all the rocks in Israel. And I've never been there in person. I would love to go one day. But I keep hearing that, yes, it's a very rocky place. And if you've ever been to Austin, Texas, and around there, you understand what rocky looks like. But I would assume that Israel is a lot more than that. This is a model of the 1st century AD Jerusalem city. If you were looking at it coming down a road or something, or from the air, what it might have looked like. It's just a scale model. This is from the Mount of Olives that is adjacent to Jerusalem, that you could see the city in its splendor. And when Jesus was giving his instruction on the Mount of Olives, they could see the city in the distance. And this is a view from the modern. This is another view, the aerial view of Jerusalem today. And this is some tools that the Jews would have used to circumcise children on the 8th day according to the law of Moses, according to the institution that was given. And these are circumcision instruments. I do not have to describe how they work. This is a ritual bath. These would have been used to go through the Jewish ritual rites, like the vows that we talked about. These 4 men purified, Paul would have purified himself. Involving these baths, they would have purified themselves. And they shaved their heads, and this is one of the instruments they would have used similar to this. This is a very old, even about 1,400 years older than Paul, but probably something similar that was used. The bronze razor, something that they could purify. And the razor even had to be purified whenever they shaved their heads. Nothing unclean could touch them. This is an inscription of God-fearer, as James and the apostles said concerning the Gentiles that believed, they didn't burden them with the law. And this word here is God-fearer. God-fearer is an inscription that was used concerning a Gentile that was converted to Judaism, or a proselyte. A God-fearer or proselyte would have been allowed to be here in Jerusalem at this time. And it's interesting when you look at the levels of proselytes, and we'll talk about that in another time as well. This is a modern ritual bath, or a water fountain where they would wash their hands, ritually wash their hands. This is at the Western Wall in Jerusalem today, and the Jews still go through these rites concerning their holy days in purification. This is a ritual bath of antiquity near the Temple Mount, where they would go in to the bath. Of course, there would be much more water there, and the walls would have been much more built up. And so when you go in, you would have been vertical, standing up and down, and where you just had to bend your knees a little bit to be completely washed. Again, another bath. And another model, this is the Herod's temple, and this would have been the temple that would existed in the first century. And this is a model of what it would have looked like in its grandeur. It would have been a splendid sight. I mean, just a marvelous, beautiful structure. It's possibly as close as what it would look like. This is today. You can see there's some buildings here that were not there in the first century. Some buildings from the Islam faith and things like that are on the existing Temple Mount of where it stood, as it's changed hands over the last 2,000 years. Now you have 3 religions that are represented in Jerusalem. The Jews, the Muslims, and also the Christians are all represented in their own section, their own quarter of this place. This is another model of the first century Temple Mount. And you can see the labels here. There was a court of the Gentiles. The Gentiles were not allowed to go into certain places, and there was a court of the women, and the women were not allowed to go into certain places. And then you see the holy place there in the middle, and the holiest of holies, of course, could only be entered once a year by the high priest to atone for himself and for the people. And these are more pictures of the model. The fortress of Antonia, possibly where the Roman garrison was located that they came from to retrieve Paul. And this is a crowd of people on the Temple Mount in modern times. This is what it would look like. Of course, this is just to show just how full the city could be when this riot took place. There would have been a lot of people involved in this riot. This is a garrison, or not really a garrison, but some soldiers in a reenactment at a different place. But this is what the Romans would have looked like as they lined up. Of course, this is a band of 20. The centurion would have been a leader of 100. and so it would have been a lot more soldiers involved in the release or the arrest of Paul. This is more what it would have looked like, of course, without all the modern weaponry. These would have been sort of the chains that would have been used, probably how they bound Paul. These are first century, normally worn by slaves in the first century, and another here. Another today approximate location of the fortress of Antonia and the Temple Mount. You can see that they're very close in proximity, and so the soldiers would have been able to get there rather quickly. Another view here. Of course, there would have been soldiers all along the city in sections, and they would have called out to each other to distribute the information quickly. Foundation stones at the fortress of Antonia in Jerusalem. And this is one of the assassin blades. This is the blade that they carried, a one-handed blade that was used to stab. And this is where the term assassin comes from. This is a man of the blade or of the blade. This is, when we talk about Paul being from Cilicia or Tarsus of Cilicia, this is one of the arches of, or gates in Tarsus from antiquity, and one of the roads here. It was a significant city in Paul's time. It even had its own waterworks and plumbing sewer system and irrigation system. It was a very modernized, for the period, built up educational and advanced city. And so it was a very significant statement that Paul would have made, that he was a citizen of this city. That's where we're going to stop today. I appreciate you staying to the end if you did. And I appreciate you watching these illustrations with me. I enjoy bringing them to you. And Lord willing, I'll be back again next week to bring you another lesson, this time from Acts chapter 22, as we talk about Paul's journey to Rome, moving here. And there are going to be a lot of illustrations that we can show you along the way as well. Thank you for watching.